Part 3. My Life in Uyeongdong. After staying with my uncle in Gunsung for a while, my parents made our house in Uyeongdong, Seoul. I remember vividly my childhood when my family moved to a single room in Buk Uyeongdong, Seoul. It was a time when everyone was worried about something to eat. At that time, my father was a street vendor at the Nakwon Market in Jongno. My eldest uncle opened a rice shop at the entrance of the Nakwon Market, and my father sold red pepper powder and condiments across from the rice shop. My mother usually bought red peppers at the wholesale market and ground them in a mill to supply the red pepper powder. When my mother went to a mill or Nakwon Market, she always took me with her. When I took a bus or a streetcar to Jongno, there was a horse or cow-drawn carriage on the left and right side of the main street, and there was excrements of horses or cows on the road. The means of transportation were nothing but a horse's car or an A-frame, and my mother always carried things on her head. In the days when supplies were scarce, my father seemed to have found a place in the Nakwon Market with the help of my eldest uncle in Jongno. In my memory, my father was smart and handsome, so he had a lot of regular customers and was good at business. When I was 6 years old, in 1960, there was the April 19 revolution against the liberal regime. Sometimes I could hear a distant shot. The children played marbles in the alley when they heard the gunshot. I had a big bead of iron, the only one in town. It was mine, the only one my father had bought for me. My younger brother was born in 1961. At that time, my father's business was going well, so he could save money. My mother loved my younger brother, said he was blessed. My family was well off financially. Our residence was still a single room, but there were many packages of sand lance fish in the kitchen. Sometimes my elder sister secretly took out some of the sand lance from the packages without my mother knowing it. She roasted the fish on a briquette fire and gave it to me. The lump of yellow roe in the plump sand lance was as delicious as the roe of pollock. I entered elementary school that year. As for the date of my birth, I was short of the school year. Even though I was 7 years old, my birthday was March 8th of the lunar calendar, so I was short of days based on the date of admission, March 1st. At that time, my father's elder brother, who was a police officer in Gunsan, came to Seoul, took charge of local affairs, and frequently entered the Uyeongdong office. My father wanted me to go to school early, and his brother took care of my school procedures. Until then, I was not listed on the family register. After the evacuation, when my father applied for provisional family registration in Suwon, I was missed. My father wrote down details of my family, but the judicial clerk left me out. Though my father gave him a commission, the amount was short. My second sister and I were omitted from the family register. Since it was socially chaotic and everything was lacking, it seems that my parents had no time to pay attention to such things as family register. At that time or later, many people didn't register their babies properly when they were born, because soon after the baby was born, many children died of measles and other diseases, and many parents were busy making a living, so they delayed the birth registration. Anyway, I entered elementary school and was able to enroll in family register without any problems according to the special measures right after the military revolution of 5/16. According to family register, my place of birth is Uyeongdong. It happened when I was 8. My sister, who was in 6th grade in elementary school, sometimes carried Pepper instead of my mother because she was too busy. At that age, anyone could do housework or help their parents make money. Most parents made their children work. Once, instead of my mother, my sister and I were walking out of the Nacwan market. She was carrying 6 kilograms of red pepper on her head. When we were walking along the stone wall that surrounds Pagoda Park, a middle-aged man came up from behind. He told us to follow him, saying he was an old friend of my father and that he had something to say to my father. We followed the man into a quiet alley nearby. The man took out the paper and searched his pockets here and there. "Oh, I don't have a pen." The man gave my sister money and asked her to buy him a pen. My sister took the money and ran toward the main street in Jungno. After a while, the man looked at me. "Why isn't your sister coming here? Go over there and look for your sister." I ran to where my sister had gone. My sister was running with a pen, and when she saw me, she stopped. "He told me to go see where you're coming from." My sister's face turned pale and ran toward the alley. There was no man nor a bundle of red peppers in sight. My sister slumped down, losing strength in her legs. I was young, but I could see that something big had happened. My sister and I hesitated to approach my father. My father changed his face when he listened to my sister. He slapped my sister on the cheek. "You stupid little girl. You're being swindled in broad daylight?" The face of my father, who turned into a tyrant, was distorted like a monster. My father didn't say anything to me standing next to him, but just to see the scene was a horror. Who was the shameless man who swindled and stole things from young children? He probably knew my father well, and it seems that he followed us since we entered the market. 50 years later, when I go to Jungno, the buildings in the alley are as they used to be. When I go to the Nacwan Music Hall along the stone wall of Pagoda Park to buy saxophone parts, I can see the alley I used to go to as a child on the left side of the street. Now, it is not a red pepper errand, but I pass this way for my hobby. My father bought an old straw house in Ohyeongdong with the money he earned from the Nacwan market. My father tore down the straw house and built a tile-roofed house with 3 rooms. It was a decent house with tiles on the roof and a tin water spout. It was the best house in town. My father had extra money, so he lent money to my maternal cousin for business. My sister entered a girls' middle school in Yongsun, Seoul. Now that I think about it, we were all well off at the time, but the hard-won luck didn't go on. My father lost his job when I was in the 2nd grade of elementary school. Amid the chaos and change of society, the military revolution of 5/16 had changed our society a lot. My father's workplace, the Nacwan market, was in the midst of a change. My father made a separate request to the official in charge of redevelopment to get a shop at the market after redevelopment. However, Nacwan Market became a road for cars and a large shopping mall was built on top of it. Upstairs, there were instrument stores, a theater, and a big restaurant. There was no room for my father. With the redevelopment of the market, my father was in a position where he couldn't do anything. There was a car seat shop on the road facing Piccadilly Theater and Dongsunsa Theater on Jungno Samga, Seoul. My maternal cousin, who borrowed money from my father, set up a small car seat shop there. My father sometimes stopped by the shop. He used to watch closely the repair of car windows and seats. My mother sometimes took me to the shop. My cousin didn't return the money because he was not making money. Sometimes he left the shop on purpose to avoid it. One winter, my mother, who had been waiting for my cousin for a long time, got angry and picked up my cousin's overcoat. It was like my mother had his things. That night, my cousin came to my house, protested loudly, and took his coat, but didn't pay. Later, my cousin was successful and moved to a big shop in Jungno. Perhaps to pay back the debt, he later paid the tuition fee for my sister's enrollment in Lasara Dressmaking School in Dongdaemun, Seoul. From this time on, my father drank a lot. There was often a bitter argument with my mother. Rather than an argument, it was more like my father's one-sided assault. At that time, I thought my parents were arguing over money matters. Now that I think about it, the real reason why my father had an argument was because of his mistrust of people, especially my mother, caused by the war. He pulled my mother's hair and pushed her hard against the wall. I was afraid that my mother would die. My father radiated a laser-like light from his eyes. He threw everything with his hands. A big jar was broken. The man who lived next door to my house even stopped my father. The man dragged my father out of the door and passed his cigarette to my father's mouth. He lit the cigarette and my father breathed for a while. I prayed earnestly that my father would smoke and pleaded it would stop his anger. They said cigarettes had a calming effect, but it was only for a moment. As a child, I felt uneasy because I couldn't do anything about it. There were times when my father was drunk and fought with my mother. Besides, there were times when no one was around him. I wished someone would show up and stop the fight. My father was fond of drinking and smoking. There was a cigarette named Arirang. It was said to be the first filtered cigarette in Korea, which was sold in 1958. A pack of cigarettes cost around 25 won, but many adults used to pick up the cigarette butts that others had smoked when they ran out of money. Few people bought a cigarette from a corner shop or a stall and smoked it. Back then, it was not embarrassing to pick up butts because of the shortage of all the supplies. Some children picked up scrap metal, such as nails and shells. We exchanged them for taffy to eat. There was a lot of scrap metal on the road that was washed away by rain. My father's drunken behavior got worse every day. When my father was drunk and bullied my mother, I ran to my uncle to ask him to come over, but my father would only stay calm for that time. The quarrel between the husband and wife was called cutting water with a knife, and no one else intervened. Even if I had reported it to the police, they would have turned a blind eye. The reopening of the Nakwon market made it harder for our family to live. To make matters worse, my sister suffered from an incurable disease at an early age. In medicine at the time, it seemed like it was a difficult disease to treat. My sister, who studied well, was often absent because of pain in her stomach. She was treated at Shincheon Severance Hospital, and my mother bought herbal medicine such as Siberian chrysanthemum and fed her with it. Yet there was no improvement. Eventually, my sister gave up her studies. My parents rented the main room and were relegated to the opposite room. It was said the rich would be ruined in 3 years, but there was no food in the house in less than a year. At one time, we ate flour supported by the U.S. government. Sometimes, the flour was mixed with bran. My mother sifted flour and kneaded it to make Korean soup with dough flakes, or bread by putting yeast in it. When I came back from school, my mother used to cook the soup for me. The soup with scallions and sesame oil was really delicious. However, when we ran out of flour, we starved. Some days, I went to school without any food from evening till morning. I couldn't hear the teacher's explanation at all. One day, when I went to school without eating anything from the previous evening, my mother came to the school classroom. My mother opened the sliding door during class and called the teacher. I was curious about what was going on, but I didn't feel ashamed. I was only hungry, so I had no other idea. My mother asked the teacher to forgive her and brought me home to eat. I wondered how she got rice, but I hurried back to school. After eating, the contents of the class that my teacher taught me popped into my head. A few years later, my youngest brother was born in the opposite room. It was January of the lunar calendar, so it was cold. I was at the main room and waited until the birth was over. When I heard my brother's first cry, the main room man told me that I would be happy to have a younger brother. I had a smile and felt a sense of humility. My father helped with the birth on his own without a midwife. The youngest always cried because he was sick. My parents could not afford to go to the hospital, so the youngest ate breast milk until he was 5 years old. We moved from our new house to a nearby thatched house in 3 years. My parents reduced our house to raise money for living. Even in this house, my parents rented a main room, and we lived in a small room in front of the gate. It was a small room where 7 family members could not sleep with our legs stretched out. In the small room, my parents sometimes talked in Japanese. I didn't know about it, but it was like a conversation where they were looking for a way to get rice. My parents spoke Japanese so that we, the little ones, wouldn't understand it. When I heard the Japanese words many times, I could see that the word okane means money and gome means rice. I remember my childhood when I was hungry. As I grow older, the memory becomes clearer. I don't want to be an old man wandering through my memory, but I don't want to just cover up the past. When winter came, my mother went to Ahyeon Market and picked up the cabbage leaves on the bottom of the market road. My sister and I followed. We even made kimchi with the cabbage leaves we had picked up. There was something to eat in Ahyeon Market. Near Golibong-dori, there was a noodle factory. When they boiled noodles at dawn, they sold the leftovers cheaply. At 4 a.m., when the curfew was lifted, my sister and I went to the noodle factory with the children of our neighborhood, carrying a basket and a bowl. Inside the noodle factory, there was a square concrete tank that looked more than a meter high. When the water in the tank was almost drained, there was leftover noodle scraps on the floor. The noodle factory sold them for a few won. We brought it in a basket and we used to eat it as a substitute for a meal. There was also a brewery. After making rice wine, they sold the rice wine lees cheaply. Eating the lees instead of rice made my face grow drunk, but I was able to soothe my hunger. When I went to the market, there was a girl who sold sesame salt. The girl strapped a small box of sesame salt into a string tied around her neck and walked around the market selling it. Even if the girl sold out the box's sesame salt, would it have cost as much as 100 won at the time? I envied the girl who made money even though it was small. One day I told my sister to do business with sesame salt and make money. My sister, sell the sesame salt at the market. My sister, who was too young to sell sesame salt, burst into tears at my words. I soon regretted it. I could not say anything more.